I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 84 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, September 26, 2023, the committee is meeting to discuss Bill C-33, an act to amend the Customs Act, the Railway Safety Act, the Transportation of Dangerous Goods Act of 1992, the Marine Transportation Security Act, the Canada Transportation Act, and the Canada Marine Act, as well as making consequential amendments to other acts. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing order, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I wish to inform members of the committee that all witnesses appearing virtually have been sound tested for today's meeting and have passed the test for the benefit of our interpreters. Joining us today, colleagues, we have from the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority, Robert Louis Manning, Chief Executive Officer, joining by video conference. Welcome. Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, we have Duncan Wilson, Vice President, Environmental and External Affairs. Syndicat des Débardeurs, Section Locale 1360.
From the Syndicat des Débardeurs, Local Section 1375, from the CUPE, we have Marie-Christine Morin.
Joel Kennedy, Director, Rail Sector, by video conference, as well as Mr. Graham Cox, Natural Representative. We begin with opening remarks, and for that, I will turn the floor over to Mr. Louis Manning. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As you mentioned, I am the CEO at the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority, and I've just recently joined in the last 7 months. I've assumed the role with a background of about 30 years in shipping and logistics. I hope to provide you with somewhat of a unique perspective on Bill C-33. Today, I'm speaking to you from the territory of the Lekwungen people, the Songhees Nation and the Esquimalt Nation, whose historical relationship with the land and the harbour continue to this day. So why is Greater Victoria Harbour Authority unique? Well, really it's unique because it's not a Canadian Port Authority, despite the name. In reality, Transport Canada remains the regulatory authority under the Canada Marine Act in the City of Victoria, which is an important nuance when considering the legislative amendments. When the federal government divested these port assets over 20 years ago, there was intent for GVHA to become a Canadian Port Authority, but a number of challenges persisted. Notwithstanding, we now steward the majority of harbour infrastructure, including a number of marinas, facilities, water lots, and a strategically located deep-water industrial terminal with 4 vessel berths, a warehouse, and a large laydown area. If you were to compare us to the existing 17 Canadian port authorities, we would be a mid-sized port in Canada, according to revenue, vessel movements, and physical infrastructure. We are the #1 destination port for cruise ships in Canada, with over 330 large cruise ships and about 1 million passengers visiting annually, over 100 commercial cargo ships every year, and several unique services, including wet docking, underwater cable storage and deployment, and support of a large-scale ocean cleanup effort. We also steward several iconic assets such as the Lower Causeway in front of the Fairmont Empress Hotel, Ship Point, and the Breakwater. The Greater Victoria Harbour Authority has a unique governance structure, including 6 member agencies representing local businesses and governments, and that are essentially shareholders, and most importantly, 2 rights holders, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. Much of the intent in Bill C-33 is supported, including the need to meaningfully engage Indigenous peoples and local communities. The GVHA has adopted these principles since its inception, and it has facilitated a high degree of trust and the ability to pivot quickly for unexpected challenges, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Having Indigenous leaders as part of the GVHA's board of directors has led to several opportunities that may have not been possible previously. We also have advisory committees and a high level of interest and involvement with local community stakeholders. Likewise, the proposed requirement to have climate change and climate adaptation plans and reporting makes imminent sense, considering the vulnerability of ocean infrastructure and the supply chain and its importance to the well-being of the Canadian economy and Canadians. The Greater Victoria Harbour Authority is in the process of developing both of these plans, including a resiliency strategy tied to sustainable finance and low-carbon trading opportunities to help reinvest in physical infrastructure to mitigate climate impacts. Our electrification strategy is now underway, includes both cruise and cargo shipping. We will be making an application for federal funding in the coming months, and GVHA is a partner in the Pacific Northwest Green Shipping Corridor project. The GVHA is actually strategically located to support a more efficient supply chain, reduce overall impacts to the environment and local communities, and support preparedness and responses to incidents involving commercial shipping. With respect to the cumulative impacts from marine shipping, we are aware of the significant dialogue between the federal government, ports in British Columbia, and local communities regarding the impacts from supply chain disruption. In this respect, the proposed amendments do not appear to be sufficiently robust enough to directly encourage regional port and waterway coordination and the efficient use of regional infrastructure. The management of vessel traffic should not be made in isolation and should leverage regional capabilities. For example, our 4 deepwater berths could support awaiting cargo exports from other ports, reducing carbon intensity and impacts on local communities. Regardless of this weakness in the bill, we are working with partners to make this a competitive option and an advantage for exporters in the future. We would encourage the federal government to adopt this type of approach in its developing of the supply chain strategy. Similarly, the Canada Marine Act should better leverage existing infrastructure, support contingency operations. In 2021, the GVHA played a pivotal role in the response to the Zim Kingston fire, providing a base of operations for salvage operations. In closing, I think the preamble of the Canada Marine Act identifies the needs for a systems approach, and this legislation could be strengthened in order to provide that systems approach. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis Manning. Next, we have Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening. On behalf of the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear this evening. There's no question that a review of the workings and structure of Canadian port authorities was overdue, and we commend the government for recognizing that updating the Act was necessary. There are, however, parts of the bill that concern us and some amendments that we fear represent a step backwards and reflect a lack of confidence on the part of government in a system which continues to provide significant benefits for Canadian trade and the Canadian economy. It is our view that the time was right for the government to take a further step back and allow port authorities more flexibility in their operations by reducing regulation. Instead, this seems to be a move towards a more prescriptive approach to the operation of ports in an attempt to impose a one-size-fits-all model on all ports with very different business models and local context and very different levels of financial capacity. The Port of Vancouver operates in one of the most challenging environments of any port in the world. We're one of the most diverse ports in North America, handling a wide range of cargo, including intermodal containers, bulk products, including grain, potash, coal, sulfur, automobiles, break bulk, and we also host a very successful cruise industry business. We do this in a region where we interact with 16 local governments and a large number of First Nations. Most ports around the world deal with only one local jurisdiction, and few would deal with more than 2 or 3. Our Terminal 2 container project, for example, we signed mutual benefit agreements with 26 First Nations. We meet regularly with all of the municipalities, the board of the port, including annual meetings with our senior executives and board of directors. I cite this complexity to illustrate the challenges to government assuming a greater role in port operations. We welcome the provisions of the bill that provide ports with more authority for vessel traffic management. The increase in vessel traffic in some sectors has made clear to us that the most efficient and environmentally responsible use of the port is to reduce the need for ships to sit at anchor and ensure safety. We require additional authority. Whether the bill will meet these needs will depend on the regulations that come. The Port Authority has also in place the sort of committees mandated by the bill related to Indigenous peoples and municipal governments. Whether having those committees mandated by legislation will enhance their effectiveness or limit flexibility remains to be seen. But I can emphasize that we give this local engagement a very high priority and constant attention. At the same time, we recognize that a model that works for us is not necessarily appropriate for smaller ports with much more limited means in dealing with a fraction of the governments and First Nations we engage with. We share the Association of Canadian Port Authorities' concerns regarding the level of port borrowing limits and the extremely long process required to increase them. The current process involves several departments, is measured in years, and bears little relationship to a port's financial capacity. While we are hopeful the new process may offer a slight improvement, we were hoping for a more nimble, market-based approach. I would also echo the Association's concerns regarding the appointment of board chairs by the Minister. We believe the current system has worked well and that it is extremely important to have a chair who enjoys the confidence of the board. Port Authority boards of directors follow a written code of conduct which establishes clear rules for regarding conflicts of interest, inside information, and more. They collectively bring an extensive and diverse mix of expertise and skills to enable good governance and oversight of port operations and set strategic direction. We also share ACPA's view regarding the need for increased and more predictable infrastructure spending. We are hoping that the newly created supply chain office within Transport Canada will signal the government taking a more active role in coordinating projects outside of port jurisdiction. In some of the early rounds of infrastructure investment in the 1990s, major projects were completed that dramatically enhanced the efficiency and safety of the supply chain. These projects involved a large number of players, including railways, numerous municipal governments, the province of BC, and terminal operators. It is unlikely they could have been completed without Transport Canada playing a significant coordinating and convening role to bring the parties together. Unfortunately, in recent years, this role has largely been abandoned and is left to the Port Authority to try to play this role despite a lack of jurisdiction and capacity. We believe that the current model for operating Canada's ports has been a great success story for the government of the day, and the government of the day showed great foresight in creating a system which maintained a role for government while allowing ports to operate at arm's length, overseen by boards that include representatives from all levels of government. We encourage the government to continue moving forward with this model, tweaking it where necessary, but recognizing the value of allowing ports to manage their businesses within the framework of the Act. Thank you again for the invitation to appear this evening, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. Prochainement, nous avons Madame Morin.
We now have Ms. Morin. Madame Morin, you have the floor. You have 5 minutes for your opening statement. Well, good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation. You will see that I'm going to talk about different things than those who have just spoken. I'm here today to represent workers who are members of CUPE at the ports of Montreal, Trois-Rivières, and Bécancour, namely the longshoremen of Trois-Rivières and Bécancour, Local 1375, as well as the grain workers of Local 5317 and the railwaymen of the Port of Montreal, Local 5598. My main concern today is obviously to maintain and improve the working conditions of our members employed in the maritime and rail sectors. You heard my colleagues Rob Ashton and Michelle Murray on October 16th regarding their concerns about Bill C-33's potential to interfere with labour relations and labour law. I noted the assurances we received from Transport Canada's ADM of Policy, Mr. Serge Bijimin, on October 16th, to the effect that Bill C-33 is not intended to apply to labour relations. In any case, the best way to be sure would be to clarify this point within the bill itself. Take the example of this bill's new section, which gives unrestricted power to the minister to intervene if, in his opinion, something needs to be done to deal with a danger of safety, including the safety of property, which is very broad. The use of the certificate of urgency, which is in Article 31.2, is in the same vein, whereas the bill seems to tend to confuse security and safety. This confusion was also raised for other reasons in the brief submitted by the Railway Association of Canada. Section 107.1.1 of the bill provides that if the minister is of the opinion that there is a risk of imminent danger to national economic security or competition that would constitute a significant threat to the security of goods or the supply chain, the minister may order a port authority to take any measures that the minister considers necessary to prevent the danger. At CUPE 5598, The Montreal Port Authority is my direct employer and the cheminots' direct employer, so you can understand our concern. In short, we are concerned that in the absence of any intrinsic safeguards in the law, the minister's new powers will be used as he wishes. It could be used to undermine fundamental rights, particularly in the area of labor relations. I'm talking about freedom of association, Article 2D, but also freedom of expression, 2B, and freedom of peaceful assembly, 2C. But Canadian law and jurisprudence, for example, the Canadian Labour Code, as well as international treaties and jurisprudence, provide safeguards, especially the jurisprudence at the ILO, and these ensure social justice and respect for fundamental rights, notably the right of association, which includes the right to free bargaining and the right to strike. This is why we are testifying today in favor of adding an interpretation clause to Bill C-33 along the following lines. And I'm just making a suggestion here. The interpretation and application of this act must in no way interfere with labor relations and must respect A, fundamental rights, including the right of association, B, the Canada Labour Code, and C, the international labour law that exists and Canadian commitments in this area. If the bill doesn't present any interference in labour law, then I think that that should be included in the law so that it is very clear. Thank you very much for your attention and cooperation. Thank you very much, Ms. Morin.
We have Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Cox. I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Joel Kennedy, Unifor's Rail Sector Director, and I am here with my colleague Graham Cox, who's also from Unifor. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on Bill C-33. Unifor is Canada's largest union in the private sector and represents 315,000 workers in every major area of the economy. Unifor represents 32 bargaining units and close to 10,000 members in the rail sector. This includes engineers, conductors, locomotives, freight car mechanics, locomotive mechanics, electricians, crane operators, and a contingent of semi-skilled support workers such as laborers and production workers who manufacture freight car, locomotive, and track components. Unifor also represents 2,300 workers in the marine sector. In the rail sector, Unifor members perform safety inspections on freight cars physically, visually, audibly, and sometimes even by smell. Our members perform brake tests, inspect the train's mechanical components and to ensure that they are working properly and are free of defects. Current legislation requires these trains to be inspected and tested at a train's origin and destination points. However, regulatory exemptions have already been granted that allows rail companies to remove safety inspections and tests conducted by a qualified mechanic and to be replaced with technology that is limited largely untested and unregulated. We believe digital inspection creates some conflicts when the interests of the company's profits and the inspection results do not align. Unfortunately, technology and digitization is referred to in this bill only in the context of facilitating efficient supply chains and rules making. Unifor believes this bill continues and entrenches the fox watching the hen house type regulatory environment for the rail sector. We believe that the large rail employers have taken advantage of this deregulated environment and they're hiding behind safety to increase their bottom lines. In an unregulated automation system, there will be a lot of pressure for systems to be tweaked not only for safety, but for convenience. Unifor believes technology should be invested in and implemented to increase safety and security of our supply chains. However, as it stands now, the focus has been on replacing workers while attempting to reach the same level of safety. There is even a current arbitration before the board about whether this digital safety inspection work is covered by Unifor's contract. The U.S. Department of Transportation's Volpe Center research on rail technology has said replacing workers should not be the focus of technology implementation. The Volpe Center's recommendation is to promote the augmentation of work, not the replacement of work with technology to increase the safety of the rail system. It is our understanding that this is also the position taken by the U.S. White House. We submit that any change to Canadian legislation that oversees safety should include the principle of augmentation in the pursuit of increased safety, not simply to replace workers in search of increased profits. Unifor is also concerned that the amendments made by Bill C-33 on the ability to consult with third parties is just language to support the outsourcing responsibility to a third party on regulations and exemptions. If the minister's office feels it does not have in-house capacity to make good decisions on rules and exemptions, it should invest in a publicly financed independent research arm to look at the impacts of rules, exemptions granted, and the implementation of technology, not a private third party. Unifor is concerned that private third-party recommendations will be based on private, proprietary data. Safety management systems and security management systems are already black boxes because they use software as if software development is some alien process and cannot be regulated. Unifor maintains that rulemaking and the exemption process should be made public. Therefore, data collected on the impact rules and exemptions should also be made public. Finally, we also like to echo concern brought up by our comrades at CUPE and ILWU about the implications of new powers of the minister when it comes to sustaining supply chains. While we recognize the language was written to deal with pandemic-like emergencies, we feel the language is too broad and though not the intention of the language, could be used to interfere with the right to strike. We believe the best model for expanded powers for emergency should be done, though, through a list of issues and types of disruption that can constitute emergencies and actions impacting supply chains. We submit that such a list can be clear to the public while also sufficiently broad to deal with security against external actors without undermining charter rights and legitimate actions. And I would like to also say our friends at Teamsters adopt our positions as well, and they couldn't make it here today for certain reasons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy. We'll begin our line of questioning this evening with Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to all the witnesses for appearing here at this late time slot. I'm once again quite shocked to hear from another panel of witnesses, some of whom had faint praise for the bill, but most of whom have significant concerns with it. And it just, to me, shows that the Liberal government did not do its homework before bringing this bill forward and did not meaningfully consult with the people that will be most affected by it. That's certainly what we are hearing, panel after panel, meeting after meeting. So it'll be interesting to hear the minister explain that in a couple of meetings from now. I want to go to the port, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, Mr. Wilson. We've heard a number of witnesses. I think I think this bill, quite frankly, was drafted with the port that you represent in mind. I think we've certainly heard that some of the provisions in the bill will be extremely onerous for smaller ports that do not have your financial capacity, the number of employees, or the ability to set up some of the mandatory requirements that have been included in the bill. You did mention your concerns with the one-size-fits-all approach, but could you maybe quantify for the port, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, what your estimate is in terms of the number of employees that you would have to hire or the amount of money you would have to spend to come into compliance with the new requirements in the bill, including reporting and setting up of mandatory committees and that sort of thing. We've heard some ports, we're looking at $200,000, multiple new employees. I'm wondering if you have a number.
Thank you for the question. I would start by saying that for most of the things that are required under the bill are things that we're already doing, so there isn't any incremental cost. There are a couple of exceptions to that. One is the financial reporting requirements will add cost. We estimate that at, I believe, around $200,000 a year. The area is an area where there will probably be increasing cost for us into the future, but it's an area we're very active in anyway and intend to continue stepping up in is with respect to the environment. So the requirement to publish annual climate plans and to publish climate adaptation plan and report out on those plans That will create some extra work, but a lot of that stuff we're already doing. But those are areas where we're already active, and we already have large initiatives underway to advance those. So for us, again, it's a less onerous change to what we're doing on a day-to-day basis than it would be for many of the smaller CPAs.
Right. In a previous meeting, a Liberal member of Parliament stated that, quote, "I can tell in Metro Vancouver there are lots of conflicts and disgruntlement, that the port seems to trump the community's environmental or other priorities. I think we can do better." I said at the time that I was looking forward to your ability to respond to that. Do you accept that you trump the community's concerns and are not responsive to them?
We invest heavily in our local community engagement and our local government engagement with 16 communities, obviously 16 municipalities that touch the port. There's a lot to do. And, if you think about the Port of Vancouver, it's the country's largest industrial port operation, immediately adjacent to communities on all sides. There's about 640 kilometers of coastline around which we have jurisdiction. And so that touches a lot of people. And those interfaces are necessarily going to, from time to time, create conflicts. I would say with the overwhelming majority of municipalities, we have a very strong working relationship. We meet regularly with the mayors. We have staff liaison committees. We have, as I said, executive meetings with the mayors. We have an annual board meeting with the mayors. And we work very hard to address local community concerns. So, for example, if we go back to the purpose clause of the Marine Act, it's very much about facilitating Canada's trade policy priorities, while at the same time protecting the environment and considering the input of communities. So we're required by legislation to do that, and it's an area we take very seriously. Often we can do what they would like.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You have 50 seconds, Mr. Strahl.
Okay. We heard from a witness that said that increasing port borrowing limits puts taxpayers at risk. Can you address that concern from your perspective? If you're given an unlimited borrowing limit, for instance, do you feel that taxpayers are put at risk if you would, for some reason, have the inability to pay?
So, again, under the Canada Marine Act, we're required to be financially self-sustaining. So we don't receive tax dollars for operations. In fact, we pay an annual stipend to the Government of Canada. So from our perspective, the dollars we're using are the dollars that are paid to us by port users. So that's the source of revenue. And I don't see any place where taxpayer dollars would be at risk. And I would point out that if we move to a more market-based borrowing regime, that would take care of itself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson, and thank you, Mr. Strahl. Next, we go to Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair, and welcome to our guests this evening, the witnesses. It's great to see the folks here today, and we're counting on, of course, trying to produce a good piece of legislation, C-33, but we're certainly counting on the knowledge, expertise, and experience of people that are around this table this evening to give us some good guidance and produce legislation which is going to effectively improve and enhance our supply chain. First question is for Mr. Lewis Manning, and then Mr. Wilson will come to you with the same question. Should C-33 pass, the federal government will have authority to make regulations with respect to how anchorages are managed at the ports. What kind of things would you like to see in these potential regulations? So Mr. Lewis Manning and then Mr. Wilson.
Hi, thank you for the question, Mr. Rogers. At the moment, the Port of Victoria doesn't have any anchorages within its harbor, so it's not as applicable. I think the question is probably best suited for Mr. Wilson, if that's all right.
realizing I shouldn't push my own button here. We're actually very happy with the direction of the legislation with respect to management of traffic and anchorages. We have, in addition to the anchorages inside the port's jurisdiction, we also currently have a temporary protocol in place with Transport Canada for the Gulf Island anchorages. We are trying to find ways to reduce the impact of those anchorages by finding ways to have more vessels tied up within port jurisdiction. That's an area of a lot of work right now for us, and something that we're taking very seriously, but we're comfortable with the legislation the way it is.
Mr. Wilson, how do you see data sharing helping ports become more efficient and more competitive? And do you think C33 will help end-to-end digitalization of our supply chain?
C33 is maybe less about that specifically, but it's that digitalization is a huge focus for us. So we have a program in place. We call it Connect Plus, which is a combination of active vessel traffic management and a supply chain visibility initiative, which are intended to work together to provide enhanced visibility in terms of cargo movements across all sectors in and out of the gateway, again, so that we can be more efficient, move cargo faster, reduce the impact on communities of things like anchorages, and also reduce the impact of shipping on for example, at-risk southern resin killer whales.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cox, or your counterpart there, how would you describe the relationship between ports and labor generally? And would you say there's a need to create more forums for ports to engage with labor, such as the advisory committee that's being proposed in C33?
I'll take that. We don't really represent a lot of workers working directly at ports. We represent mostly workers who are working in the marine sector, trying to get goods from trains to the boats. So folks that work for CNTL and Fast Freight for CP, moving goods in the intermodal system. And then we also represent folks who are along canals and moving goods on the boats themselves. So we don't really have a lot of say over the, or we wouldn't have a lot of to comment on the interaction with the ports themselves. We deal with the employer associations when we're bargaining. And most of that is dealt with in BC through the coordinated bargaining and sector bargaining agreements that we have there.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Wilson, you made reference to earlier, you said like for ports to be more nimble, market-based approaches in terms of how we, I guess, structure governance and board chair and so on, which, of course, there are some different opinions on how that should happen. So you have any other comments on that, particularly of how we should or shouldn't have a chair appointed by a board, a minister, or endorsed by somebody else?
I think it's very important to keep in mind that boards of directors of port authorities in Canada, that once appointed to the board of directors, your fiduciary duty is to the port authority, not to the body that appointed you. And therefore, to have the minister appointing sort of over top of that in a more political manner seems to be inconsistent with that approach. And also means that the chair would not enjoy the confidence, necessarily enjoy the confidence of the board. It says that the legislation says that it would be done in consultation with the board of directors, but from our perspective, I mean, different ministers will have different approaches, and having the chair appointed that way creates a significant leverage point.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson, and thank you, Mr. Rogers. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
We now have Mr. Barcelou-Duval. You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will start with Ms. Morin. Here's my question. It will relate to your main claim, your main concern. You said that it would be important to add an interpretation clause to Bill C-33 that we are studying right now. You want to ensure that despite what can be read at some clauses, that the minister would have the power to say, unblock the supply chain, but for safety and security reasons, the minister could intervene directly in port matters. How would you see this, actually? This, if we didn't add an interpretive clause, or if we didn't get any legal advice, do you think that you would nonetheless have enough confidence in this bill for it to actually go forward? Well, I think the answer is no. And we heard all sorts of arguments regarding shortcomings in this legislation, namely the fact that there could be some partisan appointments to the boards. But with regard to the guidelines that are missing, I think you really have to add some, because even if the legislator's intention isn't what we think, in a few years, somebody somewhere might use this bill, and they will use the discussions that we're having today to interpret it, but it isn't written down, so we haven't won anything. It would be really good to have a clause, just some guidelines, some limits, because right now the minister's powers are very broad, and they certainly aren't very transparent. For example, the minister can just decide that he doesn't have to publish his order for various reasons. And there are some clauses as well whereby he won't be under any parliamentary oversight. As for the requirements, those are also unclear. We know that when it comes to a possible strike, well, we can look at the employees' arguments and political arguments, but I think that we have to have a level playing field here. That's in fact what we are looking for. We have to give more ammunition to make sure that we have some power, not that the minister can just cut into our rights. I think that's fundamental. And this bill right now is opening the door to that type of ammunition and could undermine the union rights and the rights of all of the workers who work in the maritime sector or the rail sector. Thank you for your answer. As far as I'm concerned, when a government has to come with a special piece of legislation to Parliament, it has to be voted upon, it has to be debated, and here if you just have a ministerial order, then he can just write that up in his basement and the matter is resolved. I don't think that that's a good way to proceed. It's quite problematic. Earlier on, you said that it might be good to add some guidelines to the ministerial power so that we could determine how things are going to proceed. If a minister thinks that, it doesn't even have to be proven, he can just think that there is a risk or an emergency. What kind of guidelines would you set, or boundaries? Well, as I said earlier, I think an interpretive clause that says that the legislation does not apply to labor law and fundamental rights, I think that would be the best thing. Otherwise, it takes more than some estimate or guess. I think the minister has to prove. And the other thing that is a bit awkward, here you're protecting things, cargo. Do you think that if there is, say, a crate of oranges is endangered on a boat, is that a safety issue, a security issue? I might be exaggerating, but that's as far as it could go. When you talk about right of association, essential services are designed so that people can exercise their right to strike up to a point where there is a danger for the health and safety of the population. We're talking about people, not things, not an orange crate. But a strike is an economic tool. I don't want to just talk about strikes here, because there are all sorts of other things that could happen and force some bargaining or some arbitration. And as you said, there are very few guidelines or democratic boundaries here that would require a negotiation where everybody could have their say. So here we have the possibility of a minister or deputy minister who could look at that, and nobody else could intervene. Then we would have to launch a constitutional challenge. But I think this is nearly a fait accompli. So I think the solution is to have an interpretive clause added that would say that this bill does not apply to matters pertaining to labor law. Thank you very much.
The floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us this evening. I wanted to start on the topic of port borrowing, which has been a focus of the discussion around this bill, and I understand that the port authorities would like greater flexibility and the ability to borrow on private capital markets to finance infrastructure that's much needed. I'm curious, though, whether port authorities can, if they're behaving more like a private corporation, whether they can also go bankrupt in a situation whereby they have insufficient revenue to service the debt they take on. Can the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority go bankrupt?
This is, I think, actually a market-based borrowing regime protects against that, because the borrowing would be available to the Port Authority would be directly related to its financial security and our earnings and our balance sheet and what we can afford. Where financial requirements are beyond that, I could see it being reasonable for a port to need to get a special approval from the government on a borrowing limit that would go beyond that. But my view is that the market in the case of a port authority, particularly because of I can't speak for the other port authorities, but in the case of the Port of Vancouver, we're the most diversified port, and we have diverse revenue streams, and so we are very low risk.
Right, but risk notwithstanding, like there's a larger question here that applies to all ports. We look at the port of Oshawa, for instance. They got into a position where they were in real financial trouble, and their liabilities outstripped their assets by a significant level. And I believe one auditor said that they were at risk of becoming no longer a going concern, which kind of sounds like going bankrupt. Only port authorities can't go bankrupt because they're backed by the Canadian public as public institutions. So I guess what I'm getting at here is part of the trade-off for that flexibility is potentially increased risk in the case of a port that maybe isn't as diversified or makes some bad decisions about investment down the road. How does the Port of Vancouver view that risk when it comes to the Canadian taxpayer essentially underwriting this borrowing that the port would take on?
The broader port system, I mean, this is part of the challenge that I mentioned in my remarks with the legislation, is that it's a one-size-fits-all approach for Canadian port authorities. It doesn't take into account those factors, and it probably should. I expect that probably one of the reasons that they're requiring additional financial reporting is because of some of those risks. And it is somewhat burdensome to have to do it. Maybe that's I can't speak to what the authors were thinking when they were doing that, but that seems to be trying to address that.
Turning now to Mr. Kennedy and a discussion around rail safety, I think many members of the committee were disappointed that this bill didn't go further in addressing the many concerns related to rail safety that have been articulated by your union and others, and by our own work at this table and the report we released last year. One of the things that we heard from witnesses was that safety management systems have really become the primary tool for ensuring the safety of our railroads. and that they're relied on more and more heavily in as opposed to more conventional rules and inspections. Is that a fair characterization?
It is, yeah. We're seeing a lot of reliance on detection devices and self-reporting. And the issue we're seeing there is that there's no regulation of the self-reporting. There's just really no regulation holding the employers accountable in that regard. So we are seeing more reliance on self-reporting. And it really is, and I said it in my previous statement, what's really happening in the Canadian rail industry now is a real case of the fox watching the hen house. And it is quite frustrating when we're being replaced with technology to inspect, because our members are really the counterbalance in Canada to understand what's being inspected, how it's being inspected, where it's being inspected, and if these employers are even complying with regulation. And essentially, we're being cut out of the process now. We're being replaced with technology. We don't know what's going on. We don't know if the employers are even complying to regulatory exemptions they're getting. We don't know if they're in compliance. We just hear sometimes that, listen, they're not complying. We're not reported. We're not part of the process, and that's scary. We were the counterbalance in Canada, and these employers are mainly large American employers now, and it's quite interesting when they re-regulate. They're bringing in more accountability into the states, and now we got these large American employers here trying to deregulate in Canada here, and it just seems like it's a bit of a stomping ground for them. So I absolutely agree with your comment, and it is 100% on point, sir.
Mr. Kennedy, following on that, you described safety management systems as a black box. Would it be reasonable to require rail companies to make their safety management systems public?
100%. I mean, the public of Canada deserves that, especially when we have outside entities coming into Canada. We only got one chance to get this right with our environment. We've seen a lot of things happening in the States now as well, with derailments, Indigenous communities where medicines grow, our water, our land. It's absolutely, it needs to be public. Public needs to know what's going on now, and it seems to be hidden a little bit. If the public actually knew the amount of derailments that are happening in Canada a day, that there would be a lot more upset people in Canada with what's happening today now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy, and thank you, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we'll go to Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'll go back to Mr. Wilson. We've heard from railway companies in the past when their on-time performance struggles, they blame the inability of grain ships to load in the rain in Vancouver. We heard at the last meeting as well from people that are concerned about Gulf Island anchorages that the reason that happens is in part because we can't load grain in the rain in Vancouver. So I guess my question is, this has been a long-standing problem, and I understand the rulings and arbitration and situation that has got us here. Is there anything in Bill C-33 that would give some hope that this issue is going to be resolved, or will it only be resolved when the terminal operators and the workers can come up with either infrastructure solutions or address the safety concerns that prevent that from happening? Maybe just a bit of an update, if there is any, on how we can get ships loaded in the 170 days a year that it rains at the Port of Vancouver.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, grain loading in the rain is, of course, an important issue. Our understanding is would probably increase capacity by about 7% if we could do it. In terms of its effect on anchorages, though, I would say that I think that's probably somewhat overblown. The biggest effect on anchorages and reliance on so many extra anchorages is because of timing the cargoes to arrive at the port at the same time as the ship. And that's very much why the program I was talking about, the Connect Plus program, which is all about supply chain visibility and digitalization, is so critical, because that's what's going to really help us unlock some potential in that area.
And again, we heard, I'm sure you've reviewed the testimony with your team from the last meeting about the concern about the Gulf Island anchorages, and we heard frustration with trying to get new anchorages in better locations, perhaps we can say it that way. Can you, and this bill would give you some more authority over anchorages and how they operate, et cetera. Can you describe some of the challenges with creating new anchorages and whether you believe Bill C-33 addresses those? Because we've heard again, you're talking about a massive expansion there at the Port of Vancouver. So removing anchorages doesn't seem to make any sense, but there are sensitive areas where perhaps they're not best placed. So can you talk about the challenges with moving or creating new anchorages, which I think we'll need as the port expands?
The largest issue with respect to increasing new anchorages would obviously be concerns from local communities. There are places to create additional anchorages. The bill is giving us additional authority, which is going to help us more with traffic management. So we're comfortable with the bill in that regard. We are also, I think we need to. There's a paradigm shift that we need to have in the port, which I think we're well underway on, and that is that it's not just anchorages where you can tie up ships. You can also have mooring dolphins where ships could be tied up. You can also have single point moorings, which would reduce the amount of space that's required for anchorages and allow you to more vessels.
Okay. Finally, I wanted to ask you, we've heard some testimony, belief that perhaps labor representatives, and I know there's some others who believe that active port users should be able to have active employees of their companies sit on the board. Can you just explain from your perspective, you talked about the fiduciary duty. Do you see a conflict of interest if a person who's actively involved in labor at the port or actively involved in business at the port was to be given a seat at the table on the board of directors there?
Yes, I think, we welcome, we actually have a very high-profile Canadian labor leader on our board of directors currently, who's appointed by the province of British Columbia. But I think having somebody who's actively involved in the port, in working on the docks or in the business would represent a conflict of interest. It would be very difficult for them to maintain their fiduciary duty when their core income is tied to the other side.
Thank you very much, Mr. Strahl, and thank you once again, Mr. Wilson. Next, we have Ms. Koutrakis. Ms. Koutrakis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here with us at this late meeting. Your testimony is very, very important, and I'm very, very interesting conversation. Mr. Wilson, we heard, some of the challenges, some of the areas where you think that this bill can be strengthened or be better. However, I'd like to ask you on what do you think are the most positive parts of the bill? Because I'm pretty sure that there are some positive parts of the bill that you could speak to.
I think the amendments to the Purpose Clause to include Indigenous peoples is a really meaningful and significant amendment, and we applaud the government for putting that forward. We also I'm pleased in general with the focus on the environment. I think that some of the bill is maybe a little too prescriptive in terms of how we do that, but the additional emphasis there is welcome. Again, we're happy with the changes that will allow for better traffic management subject to regulations. So there is a lot of good that's in the bill, and obviously coming to committee today, I'm focusing on the things that are of concern because those are the areas that we would really like to see addressed.
And I'm just wondering if any of the other witnesses would like to chime in with your perspective on the same question. Anyone? No? Okay. My next question is for Mr. Lewis Manning. Do you think the active vessel traffic, we heard quite a bit about the active vessel traffic today. So do you think the active vessel traffic management measures in this bill will help ports operate more effectively? And if so, how?
Unfortunately, Ms. Koutrakis, Mr. Lewis Manning had to leave, so he just left about 5 minutes ago.
Okay, so then I will ask the question to Mr. Wilson. Thank you. Of course. Do you think the active vessel traffic management measures in this bill will help ports operate more effectively? And how?
yes, subject to regulation. The detail will be in the regulation. The legislation is necessarily at a higher level. And what will be very important is what's in, and that relates to not just that aspect, but borrowing and everything else, is a lot of the most meaningful changes will come forward in the form of regulation.
Thank you. Et ma dernière question, je crois, Monsieur le Président, que j'ai le temps.
Mr. Chairman, do I have any extra time for another question? Good. It's for Ms. Morin. One of the things that we heard was the need for union representation on the boards of the airport, of the port authorities. Do you agree with that? And what type of perspectives do you think the unions could provide the board members if that were to happen? My colleague, Mr. Stroll, also asked whether there was a potential here of conflict of interest. So how could we manage that? Well, I don't think it's a conflict of interest because we have the management side, so there isn't really a conflict of interest. I think that the port authorities want the port to work properly. And in order to give a good perspective of the productivity, listen to the workers. That's always a good idea if you want to have an idea of the productivity and for a business to be healthy. I support my brothers and sisters who are asking for a seat on the board. Personally, I am concerned that the union is not going to be invited to the discussions when it pertains to working conditions and all that. But despite that, it's always a good idea to have a union rep at the table to have the workers' perspective. Otherwise, there's a piece of the puzzle missing. So I don't think it would be a conflict of interest. Thank you. That's all for me. Thank you very much, Mr. Koutrakis. We have Mr. Basalou Duval now. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Wilson. It concerns the way this bill has been presented. It was tabled at the end of the parliamentary session last year, so it's been on the floor for about a year now. And there was an article that was published on the 18th of November 2022 that says it's a bill to strengthen the ties with the Quebec port authorities. It said that the minister wanted to improve the supply chain thanks to this bill and also allow a better cooperation among the ports. When I read this bill, that's not exactly what I saw. But perhaps you could tell us what you could glean from this bill that implied that we could strengthen ties with the ports, or how this was going to improve the supply chain.
The most significant changes in the legislation are, again, I think, back to giving ports additional powers with respect to traffic management. In respect to collaboration between port authorities, there's nothing stopping that today. We do communicate and work with other port authorities. Earlier this evening, I was actually with the Quebec ports at an event, and there is a lot of engagement between the port authorities through our association. I think there is an opportunity, particularly on the West Coast, probably for some greater collaboration between us and particularly some of the other ports. But there's really nothing that's preventing that. And it's not. Is that something that's required in the legislation? That's an excellent question. I would say that I think that's something that is worthy of consideration. But it's not. There's nothing right now that's a barrier to making that happen.
On a eu des témoins.
We heard some witnesses from ports who said the opposite. They were kind of being forced to compete among each other. So that goes against what you said. They would like to see some changes to the law to allow the cooperation. Are you of the same view?
can only speak for the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's perspective on this, and that is that we see our responsibility is to facilitate Canada's trade policy priorities. So what is in the interest of Canadian trade? If it makes more sense for something to go through Prince Rupert, it makes more sense for it to go through Prince Rupert. If it makes more sense for something to go through Vancouver and Nanaimo, it's about facilitating the most Canadian trade. I don't feel competitive with those port authorities.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. These rounds go really quickly, unfortunately. Mr. Bachrach, I'll turn the floor over to you next. 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Another question to Mr. Kennedy. I noted at the top that there are many things that were left out of this bill when it comes to rail safety. If the minister asked you to go back to the drawing board with him and redraft the bill, what is one thing that isn't in the current bill we see in front of us that you would like to see in legislation specific to rail safety?
And I think I touched on it. My report is in specific to rail safety, you see the augmentation of technology to enhance rail safety in Canada and to promote the best, safest rail infrastructure that we can absolutely in Canada, protect our environments, our communities, and our systems in our urban areas and our rural areas. Right now, there's nothing in there. There's no regulatory oversight with the employers. It seems that these exemptions are granted. There's no oversight, and we're essentially taken out of the house in this regard. We talk about the expedited exemption process and the granting of that. I think that we need more involvement. We need to be let in the house. We need to be able to consult, and we need more public engagement and regulatory oversight with some of the technologies and the exemptions that are actually granted.
Along those lines, one of the issues that's been raised by the families of rail workers that have been killed in rail accidents is the use of corporate rail police. Is it appropriate that the big rail companies have their own police forces and investigate themselves?
No. And at one time, possibly. However, I think those times have changed, and I think our CMP are the bodies that should be investigating any kind of rail infrastructure or accidents that are happening. I think that, historically the police were involved with the rails when we used to transport loads of money through rail and horses were coming and robbing trains, to tell you the truth. And I don't agree with that. And, that was one of the biggest issues with the CPKC merger that you saw in the States. And there was a lot of kickback and misunderstanding in our counterparts south of the border why our Canadian rail companies would actually need their own police forces. I'm still confused by that myself, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy, and thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses that have stayed with us this long. It is a late hour, and I get the honor of coming in at the end of the discussion. So, Mr. Wilson, one of the things that I was struck with in your opening statement was the fact that the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority deals with 16 local governments, and I missed the number of First Nations, but it was a large number. So maybe you can elaborate a bit. I mean, here we've got a bill that proposes that the minister appoints the chair, so that's Ottawa, and I think a lot of provisions in this bill where it's an Ottawa knows best approach to stuff that you're already doing. So, what's the point of Bill C-33?
I think from where we sit, there's not, as I said in my remarks, there's not really a large impact other than some of the very specific things like traffic management and the reporting requirements. But most of those things are just a slight tweak in terms of what we're doing right now.
But I mean, obviously you have local knowledge, you have understanding what's going on the ground, and that's the point you were making. So, does it make sense to have the minister appoint the chair, who would not maybe be aware of what's going on the ground? This seems to be a step backwards.
Yeah, we feel that the Canada Marine Act was created to depoliticize ports and put us in a position where we can be nimble in terms of decision making, and frankly, sometimes make difficult decisions that are in Canada's interest without interference from politics. So it is a concern to us.
Okay. You talked as well about, and we heard that similarly from other port authorities, obviously not as large as the Port of Vancouver, about why can't the market dictate the borrowing limit. Obviously, if there's not a business case, you're not going to get the funds from those that are lending. So maybe you can talk a bit more about that. I mean, because we heard from others that this is hampering the potential that Canadian ports have. Port of Vancouver, obviously our gateway to Asia, critically important, needs to grow, and it's important to our supply chains. And we've heard that, and that's supposed to be the intent of this bill. But yet, you still got these handcuffs.
As I said, we measured the time it takes to get a borrowing limit change in years, and we've not been turned down ever in that time. 20 years I've been with the port in terms of a borrowing limit request. It just takes a long time, and to go to a more market-based approach would really speed that up.
Let me ask Mr. Kennedy, because you bring a perspective from the rail sector, and I know that my colleague Mr. Bachrach asked about rail safety, because it's this is a bill that amends 7 acts of Parliament. It's I think we've heard it's kind of underwhelming in so many ways. So in terms of rail overall, what more could have been done in this bill? Like, I mean, we've waited how many years for a bill that hasn't accomplished much?
With more, I'm very disappointed with how loosely this bill is written, and when we talk about the oversight and we talk about expedited exemption processes, it's very frustrating because the employers in Canada, I think the major rail employers that we see in Canada, they have a different agenda. They're not mainly owned by Canadians, they're Americans, and so when we have an exemption given, it scares the crap out of me, especially when we talk about an expedited process, for an exemption process, which I think this bill alludes to. We've seen employers make an exemption, under safety, and they've removed our people from the process, and relied on technology. Even the Railway Safety Act and the freight car inspection rules, rules aren't supposed to be changed. Legislation's not supposed to be changed unless it's safer than. And we're removed from the process, and these things aren't happening. So the employers are saying they're relying on these exemptions for certain things, and it's going to enhance rail safety. But the fact is that's not what's happening in Canada. So when we talk about an expedited process, it's removing us from that process where we have a lot of good things to bring in and consult and bring from the workers' perspective and other perspectives that these large, mainly American employers don't bring to the table.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muse, and thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Next, prochainement, we will go with Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to get into the bill itself. I have to say that I'm hoping that most members of the committee read the bill and really dug deep into it. And we had a chance to meet today, Mr. Wilson, and about some of the concerns that you brought forward about the bill, and I want to get into a section 39, so actually section 114, subsection 39, with respect to the business planning process. And as part of the business planning process, there's an opportunity for port authorities to submit a 5-year business plan, and I would only assume that part of that 5-year business plan is going to be the financing part with respect to the one part of what you have, which is your asset management plan, and the second part is your capital plan with respect to where you want to be as you move on to that 5-year plan with business growth. So I want to drill down on your thoughts on the financial flexibility in terms of both borrowing as well as leveraging that exists on site, but also sometimes off site as you partner with additional organizations. So can you speak about the benefit of that, and if in fact that the amendments that you speak of would include that as part of the overall bill?
I think additional tools and flexibility would be terrific. I'm not sure that how much of it's required in the legislation versus, I mean, if we move to a market-based borrowing regime, that's obviously going to speed things up in terms of getting borrowing limits approved and being able to be nimble. I would say that when a port authority's ability to partner, and which is becoming more and more important, to be able to partner with the private sector in terms of development is something that needs to be given attention to. I think there could be more flexibility in terms of doing that, but frankly, that can be done again through changes to our letters patent, which is a regulatory process.
And what would some of those changes to your letters patent be?
It would be things like we could bring in equity partners into developments, that kind of thing. Just more flexibility. But I mean, when we made our submission on the Port Modernization Review, it was almost entirely about regulatory change, or not the Act itself. We basically supported the Act as it stood as an excellent, well thought out, forward-thinking piece of legislation with very few changes needed, and most of the changes are on the regulatory front.
And do you find that this bill brings into play the Ports Modernization Review, aligning supply chains, strengthening inter and multimodal networks, capital investments, asset management, speaking to that, port competitiveness, managing traffic, developing inland waterways, implementing strategic business plans, reducing threshold for investment notification and review, governance, expanding membership, working with advisory groups, working with stakeholders, working with indigenous groups, things of that nature. Environmental. I'm going through a list here from when I read the bill. Environmental sustainability, regulatory changes, updates in the railway area, transparency, rules, exemptions, alignment, and the list goes on. Safety, transparency, consultation, efficiency, exemptions, collaboration, adaptability, security, and the list goes on. Do you find that this hits those areas, number one, and number two, with respect to amendments? If it doesn't, is your organization, and I'm going to ask the same question to the members online, to their organization, are they prepared to actually present amendments that they feel should be presented to actually make this bill better?
Yes, we'd be absolutely pleased to present amendments to try and improve the bill. And I do think that in some cases it's adding layers of process in places where, frankly, even when it comes to liaison committees, I mean, we made the decision on our own because it was the right thing to do for our business at the time to put those two together. Having them in the Act is kind of seems a bit overkill.
Thank you. And I'll ask the members online if they can give their thoughts to what I had just alluded to.
Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Cox, Madame Morin.
Mr. Cox?
Certainly there are elements of this bill that are okay, but there's a lot of different elements that we're concerned with, and we would certainly be prepared to draft some amendments to strengthen our position and to address our concerns.
Mr. Cox, can you hear the members of the committee?
No, I can't.
We'll end it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Cox. Next, we'll go back to Mr. Muse. Mr. Muse, I'll turn the floor over to you. You have 5 minutes for a last round of questioning.
All right. So, Mr. Wilson again. We heard from one port authority that, in his opinion, nothing at all might be preferable to the proposed changes in Bill C-33. Do you share that opinion?
As I said, I think that the vast majority of changes that we think are needed to port governance do not stem from the legislation itself. They are things that can be done in consultation with Transport Canada through changes to regulation and letters patent.
Right. And would you agree? We've had some questioning tonight, from witnesses to identify positive aspects of the legislation, and it's kind of like crickets is the answer, or it's okay. It's very mediocre, lukewarm response. So,
the legislation doesn't respond to our submission on the Port Modernization Review, but our submission was not, as I said, was not primarily about the need to change the legislation. It was about the need to change all the regulation, a lot of the regulations that relate to our operations.
and I think the Association of Port Authorities, and I think you've read some of their materials. You're obviously part of the association. Had written to the minister, the previous minister, early on when the legislation was tabled and asked for clarification on some things. And then when we had the witness here, talked about additional requests for information or elaboration on these details, and we asked that question, and the answer seemed to be they hadn't got an answer back, and there were no details around it. So I think that's pretty much what you're saying as well, but we're looking for that.
Yeah, the devil is the detail, which in this case is regulation.
You talked as well about the $200,000 figure that was for your port, and we had asked the Transport Canada officials in the first meeting whether a cost analysis had been done, and the answer was no. Would you, and I know you don't speak for other ports, but would you imagine that this would be an onerous burden for some of the smaller ports?
Well, I know from what we've heard from smaller ports, that MP Stroll spoke to this, that it was sort of, it looks like it was, the legislation looks like it was designed on a lot of the things that we're doing. Right. And I know we've heard directly from many of our colleague ports about how concerned they are about it being an onerous piece of legislation for them. And the association, we support the association's position on that and their perspective.
Right. Yeah, because you've talked about some of the things that you've done proactively over the course of time that are encapsulated in Bill C-33. But that's taken time, effort, and money, and now that's going to be imposed upon others. So, I guess what you're saying is that is a burden that other smaller ports or even medium-sized ports would face.
We would be spending millions. We are spending millions on those kinds of things to do them at the scale that we need to do in a port the size of Vancouver. And I don't have a sense of how it would be for smaller ports. They're best to speak to that themselves.
Right. Wow, I'd observe that millions is a big number, considering when we were on tour and we at the port of St. John's in Newfoundland, their borrowing limit is $8 million, which will buy you, maybe one house or half a house in the Greater Vancouver area. So millions is a big cost. Nope. I have 30 seconds. What can I do in 30 seconds? Anything further to add, Mr. Kennedy, from a rail perspective?
I would just, I would like to add that, we've made our points in our brief here, and, what we need in Canada is more regulation. And this bill, in our view, is more deregulation. And, it comes at a time in Canadian history where we really got to be conscious of the environment, the lands we're running through, and respectful of those communities as well. So I think we've made it very clear in our bill what's missing and what we need to see in there. And I thank you guys for that opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy, and thank you, Mr. Muse. Next, we have Mr. Yacono. Mr. Yacono, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, bonsoir aux témoins d'être.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all witnesses for being with us tonight. Thank you for sharing your comments, your opinion on our study. So I want to start with the Greater Victoria Harbour Authority. What do you think of the environmental measures that are in the bill?
He's no longer there. Donc, je vais aller avec vous.
All right, Mr. Wilson, I'll ask you the question then.
Near in a major urban center, acreages can be a major issue with nearby communities. How does the port currently manage its acreages, and will the measure in C-33 help the port to do this more effectively?
Yes, the measures in C-33 will help us do it more effectively. Obviously, the regulation will spell out exactly how that is. We manage the anchorages on an interim protocol basis in the Gulf Islands and directly in terms of our actual jurisdiction. And it's mostly the changes that are required are mostly in the areas where we don't actually have jurisdiction. So,
thank you. You mentioned earlier at the beginning that you were quite happy with this legislation. Can you elaborate on what exactly are you quite happy about it? And let's go 2 ways. What are you really happy about, and what are you not happy, so that we can get better orientation as to what should stay and what should go, because we're getting mixed responses by the different witnesses. So you were really convincing when saying that you were happy about a lot of it. So please share with us what you're happy about.
I think when the legislation was first tabled, we were relieved because we were concerned where it may go, and it didn't go in a different direction than we were already going for the most part, with the exception of some of the governance things. I mean, it is. So I think that's what we're happiest about. Is it's a reaffirmation of a lot of the work that we're already doing in the port. And so we saw that as a positive reflection on decisions that we've taken over the years to do those things. Again, we're a very different animal than some of the smaller port authorities. So our reaction to the legislation was much different than their reaction.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but let's say I would ask you, what are the 3 things you really liked about it, and what are 3 things that you don't like about it?
I'd say I like the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the Purpose Clause. I like the provision for us to be able to direct traffic, and I like the intention of giving us a better process around borrowing limits. Hopefully, it will help.
Madame Morin, comment décrivez-vous la relation?
Ms. Murray, how would you describe the relationship between the ports and the labor force in general? Ms. Morin, can you hear us? I didn't hear that the question was for me. I was wondering if you could repeat the question, please, because it cut out. Yes, I'll give you an extra 20 seconds. So, Ms. Morin, how would you describe the relationship between the ports and the labor force in general? I would say that it's not very good. I'm very pleased with your question, because I think it was Mr. Stroll who spoke earlier about the advisory board to try to improve labor relations. I think you'd have to go further than that. The situation with the marine workers is quite different, because with the Canada Labour Code, the workers negotiate with a number of the port authority, but a number of authorities, but not directly with the employer. So that causes complicated labor relations, among other things. Okay. So you're on the ground, you're the employee's representative, and then you're there to negotiate. What exactly would you suggest the government do, or tell the negotiators what to do? What would be your strategy? Well, it depends about what. At the bargaining table, obviously, if we had the real decision makers there, rather than a port authority that is really just a group of HR specialists that do things like discipline and other things, but the real decision makers are not necessarily at the bargaining table, so that complicates matters. Also, it would take a change in culture, because I think that the port authorities know that we need to change the relationship. Perhaps the advisory board would be a step forward, but I think there would need to be even more commitment. That would involve a lot of people, wouldn't it? Well, I'd like to thank Ms. Morin and Mr. Iacono. Now we have Mr. Bazarou-Duval. All right, thank you. I'm going to ask my question of Mr. Kennedy. I have a question for you. I was quite surprised when I heard this earlier. I didn't think that it existed. In fact, I'm talking about the safety exemptions. Perhaps they existed, but sometimes we give those exemptions to rail companies and they're not public. So these are secret safety exemptions that the public isn't aware of? Well, that concerns me. You are suggesting that those exemptions be made public automatically. What impact do you think this would have on the responsibility and the resorting to that type of exemption? Do you think the rail companies would be more reluctant to abuse those exemptions?
I have to agree that they would be reluctant to abuse those exemptions, yes. And when we bring in the proper stakeholders, we get a wholesome view of impacts. For example, we've talked about bringing in Indigenous representation in boards, and, you know, we run trains through their land, period, and very, you know, unceded territory and treaty lands. And, you know, we're not consulting with everybody that we need to. And, you know, that's great. They're consulting with unions, and that's really who they're only consulting with is Transport Canada and the unions. But, you know, the fact of the matter is these trains, they go through different communities. They go through sacred lands. They go through national parks. They go through UNESCO sites, buy new UNESCO sites. You know, so when we talk about engagement, we talk about true stakeholder engagement and consultation. They're only engaging with labor stakeholders. That's it. We're not you know, engaging with all the stakeholders that actually have and would be directly impacted by any safety concerns for these regulatory exemptions. So I 100% agree with your comments that, you know, the public does need to be consulted with this, because these trains are running through their communities. The people that they're consulting right now as the unions, and we come and we bring the labor perspective, but we don't bring the voice of the communities that these trains run through. And I think that's a very, very important component. And I think that they have some ownership and some voice that they need to be able to raise with their concerns as well.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Barcelou.
Thank you very much, Mr. Basalou-Duvara.
Is Mr. Bachrach. Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again to our witnesses for staying so late and engaging with us on this topic. A question for Mr. Wilson. You know, you spoke about decarbonization at ports, and I think everyone that we've spoken to has recognized the huge opportunity that is there, and you also mentioned that many of those things are already underway in one form or another. Bill C-33 empowers the minister to require that ports produce 5-year climate plans. And, you know, that's in line with what the government is requiring of other sectors. Like, I know they've proposed it for airports as well. My observation is that a lot of corporate climate plans are PR exercises, or they are a summary of things that are going on that can be roughly construed as falling into that climate action category. But they often lack accountability measures, they lack firm targets, they lack the kind of detail that allows the government or the public to hold the entity accountable. And I'm not talking about ports in this regard, I'm just talking in general our experience over the last couple of decades with climate planning has been, I would say, fairly lackluster in the corporate sector. If this is to be a useful exercise, how should the government, how should this committee consider building accountability into ports' climate plans so that it's not just a summary of things that the port plans to do, but is actually a roadmap to get to the kinds of emission reductions that we need to see?
If the climate plan was specifically about the Port Authority on its own and not including the broader port community, that would be achievable. I would say it's not achievable in respect of the broader port, because the Port Authority doesn't have the doesn't control or have the ability to be able to compel the kind of participation that would be required from industry. We rely on collaboration with industry, which we do. But collaboration sometimes doesn't, you know, get us to the place we need to be.
So possibly splitting that question into two pieces, that there can be more accountability if it deals with the activities of the Port Authority specifically, and it's more difficult to pin down the broader port community because they're operating outside of the direct control of the Port Authority. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, and I mean this is a continuous improvement process. I mean, we need the inputs that we need in order to be able to decarbonize the port. And it's not that the terminals aren't doing the right thing; they are doing the right thing. But we need a supply of alternative energy. We need an energy We need Vancouver to become an energy hub for things like hydrogen and ethanol and other things that will allow us to decarbonize more broadly. We need greater electrification. There are plenty of things that we need that will support that. It's not as though any one, industry or the ports are pushing back on it. We embrace that, but we just need the platform to
Thank
do
you.
that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson, and thank you, Mr. Backrack. On behalf of all committee members, I would like to thank all witnesses who joined us either in person or virtually for their time this evening and for lending us their testimony to this very important piece of legislation, and for doing so at such a late hour on this Wednesday. I will now suspend the meeting, and we will go into committee business in camera for approximately 10 minutes. Thanks to everyone, and I ask all of the witnesses to now log off. Merci.
you.